Good afternoon and welcome to Agri-Food Conversations, brought to you by iSelect Fund, the Van Trump Report, the Yield Lab Institute, and Family Farms Group. My name is Tom Bunn. I'm an associate on the iSelect Fund team, and I'm excited to welcome you all to our discussion today. Agri-Food Conversations is all about driving innovation in food and agriculture. Each month, we highlight a specific theme, and this month's theme is dairy alternatives. And on today's call, we are joined by Matt Gibson, co-founder and CEO of New Culture. New Culture is tapping cellular agriculture to make dairy cheese that looks, feels, and tastes just like the real thing without requiring the involvement of dairy cows. Each of you knows companies are more likely to succeed with the right network of customers, talent, investors, and advisors. You've been invited to this call because you are some of the smartest, most talented people in New Culture's market. You are potential customers of New Culture. You've built a company similar to New Culture's, or you are a sophisticated business person or ag and food professional who understands their market and the challenges and opportunities that New Culture will face. Before we get started, we have a quick poll question to get a better idea of who we have on the call today. Please take a few seconds to answer. A few process comments as well. We are not soliciting investment in any way whatsoever. This presentation is to provide information to help New Culture find customers, mentors, or other strategic relationships that can help them grow their business. Secondly, you are all on mute. However, you can use the chat window to ask a question at any time. And finally, this presentation is being recorded and will be available for replay. So without further delay, I'm pleased to introduce Matt Gibson, the co-founder and CEO of New Culture. Take it away, Matt.
Hey, thanks for that introduction. And first of all, I just want to say thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be online and talk to everyone about dairy, which is absolutely a passion of mine. And I can never grow tired of talking about New Culture. So I'm really excited to chat with everyone today. And one thing to say is that forgive my accent. You know, I'm not from the United States, I'm from New Zealand, and sometimes that can be a bit difficult for people over here to comprehend when I talk. So just bear with me, and I'll try and be as clear as possible. So today I really want to talk about the state of dairy in the US, the history of it, the current state of dairy, and where I see it going in the future, which is where we come in and some of the future dairy innovations. So to kick things off, this is a graph that I'm sure many of you have seen, otherwise a trend that many of you know about. And it's really a reflection of how the consumer sees dairy milk and interacts with it. And that reflection here is shown in the decrease in consumption of dairy milk since 1975. And, you know, there are some pretty standard economics as to why this is happening, and some things that are very unique to dairy milk as to why we see this downward trend, and to the dairy industry overall. But you can see that, you know, a 45% drop since 1975 isn't a small amount. So why is this happening? Well, some of the key factors are to do with new competing products. So, for example, we have the introduction and the takeover from milk being the highest consumed drink to soft drinks in 1970s. And then we see the rise and the now #1 market leader in beverages is bottled water. So these other competing products are really providing a dent into dairy milk's consumption. Other things that are involved in this downward trend include this idea that whole milk is a fully healthy product that we should be consuming every day. Essentially, USDA jettisoned that in 1985. And what's really striking to me actually is when you look at the non-dairy alternatives, right? So these are the plant-based milks. You see there's actually a very interesting correlation between the downward trend of dairy milk and the rise of plant-based milk. This is something that I think will continue, having these opposite trends and actually quite correlative. So here's dairy milk. Now, if we cast an even wider net and look at all dairy products, do they show a similar downward trend? So let's do that. And you can see right away that some do. We look at ice cream, for example. That's slowly been trending down since 1975. More recently, yogurt is starting to trend down. And what you should notice right away, and what captured my eye right away when I first looked at this data a few years back, is cheese, right? There's only one product on this graph that has been continually driving upwards in consumption since 1975 and earlier. That's not on this graph. And so why is this happening? Why is cheese increasing in consumption year on year? And furthermore, why is cheese production increasing year on year? What's not shown on this graph is that the production of cheese is outpacing the consumption of it year on year. So more cheese is being produced than we can consume, even though we're consuming more and more of it. So why is this happening? Well, a lot of it is to do with milk itself. You know, milk is a perishable product, which makes it a very poor inventory store. It spoils very quickly. And so if you're facing downward market prices, a dwindling demand, whether you think that's temporary or not, you're going to want to store that inventory for a later date when prices are looking a bit better and you can sell it at a higher price. And you can't do that with milk, but you can with cheese. Furthermore, what that allows is the subsidies in the dairy market to really take a hold, because it allows the US government to start buying product that they can in turn store and release onto the market with the growing demand. And what I don't talk about here actually is more recently the rise of whey protein and the popularity of it. And if you're not aware, whey protein is a byproduct of cheese making. So when you make cheese, you have whey protein as a byproduct when the curd forms. And that's grown to be a very popular ingredient, both as a functional ingredient and as a filler for nutrition. So that's on a high level why dairy cheese isn't dropping in consumption or production. This is actually a really complicated and fascinating topic, which I'd love to talk more about, because you start getting some very, very interesting stuff, but I'm not going to do that today, reluctantly. And as to why cheese is increasing in consumption, we can really thank pizza for that. There's a really fascinating graph that, again, I don't have on here for time, but you see the rise of mozzarella versus cheddar, and how mozzarella overtook cheddar in the mid to late 2000s as America's most popular cheese product. And this is thanks to pizza. Americans love pizza. It's consumed more and more every year. And obviously, the more pizza you consume, the more mozzarella cheese you consume. So that's really a big factor that's driving cheese consumption, as well as a lot more factors that I won't get into today. And the part that really is important for me, and the part that I'll dive deeper into, is that unlike milk, unlike yogurt, and unlike ice cream, dairy cheese really has no viable alternatives. And what I mean by viable alternative is a animal-free alternative, a more sustainable alternative. I'm sure a few of you have tried plant-based cheeses before, and it's fair to say that they're not good enough to reach that bar that allows a standard dairy cheese consumer to easily transition away from a product such as dairy cheese. Now, why is that important? Why do we need viable alternatives for dairy cheese? Well, it's because cheese, dairy cheese, is incredibly unsustainable. If you look at this chart here, you'll see that when we just look at food products, not even only animal-based food products, but just food products in general, we can see that cheese is the third worst for greenhouse gas emissions, just after beef and lamb. So you can see right away that it's incredibly unsustainable. Now, the fact that it's very unsustainable, yet also has no viable alternatives, makes it that much worse, because there's no other products, there's no other sustainable products that people can move away to or towards. Unlike ice cream, unlike milk, unlike to a large extent yogurt, which is pretty good plant-based alternatives. And this is a chart that really reflects that. If you look at these key dairy traits, when we look at dairy cheese at New Culture and we look at the cheese that we make, we measure these key traits. We measure the meltability, the stretchiness, the structure of it, the texture, the mouthfeel. And vegan cheese, plant-based cheese, doesn't have any of these. So then the big question to ask is, why not? Why can't we make a delicious cheese using plant-based ingredients, like you can make a delicious milk, like you can make a great ice cream? And for me to answer that, I really quickly need to take you through how cheese is made traditionally. I'm actually pretty sure a lot of you guys already have done this before, but I'll really quickly cover it. And cheese making is really a two-step process. We have our mammalian milk, generally that's cow's milk, and we treat it in two different ways. The first way is acidification. So that is when we want to drop the pH of the milk. For the most part, you'd use a lactic acid bacteria. And what that does is it's a gram-positive bacteria that consumes lactose and creates lactic acid as a byproduct. And the reason why most people use lactic acid bacteria rather than adding directly in citric acid or acetic acid is because lactic acid bacteria also has a large role to play in the aging of harder cheeses. And then the next step is we add a coagulation agent. So that is most commonly termed as rennet or chymosin. And that is an enzyme that turns your acidified milk into a curd. And a curd is this beautiful precursor to cheese. It's a soft material that how you treat, how you age, determines the cheese you make. So for example, for a mozzarella cheese, you would have this curd, you'd dip it in hot water and you start stretching it, and you'd start turning it into a ball, and you'd come away with a fresh mozzarella. If it was an aged cheese, you would store that curd in specific conditions. You'd maybe add some aging bacteria, and you would wait 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, depending on the cheese that you want to make, and wait for that curd to become that cheese. And you'll see here, we see whey being the byproduct of curd formation. And so at New Culture, when we first looked at this, we asked ourselves, what in milk allows this to actually happen? Because obviously this is an incredibly important part of cheese making. It is cheese making, and it leads to these specific cheese attributes that we all love, as I showed on the previous slide. And it really comes down to one key ingredient that allows milk to become cheese, and that is the casein protein. So in milk, there's two types of protein. There's the casein protein and the whey protein. The casein protein represents about 80% of milk's protein content, and whey protein about 20%. And unlike whey, which are found in monomeric forms by themselves, dissolved in milk, casein proteins are found in what we call casein micelles. And you can think of a casein micelle as a ball of protein. Technically, they're called colloidal particles, where you have the 4 different types of casein protein, alpha S1, alpha S2, beta casein, and kappa casein, coming together in milk and forming these unique structures with hydrophobic interiors and hydrophilic shells. And they float around in milk and natively repel each other. and they give milk its whiteness. Milk is white because of the size of casein micelles and how they react with light. And when you go through the cheese making process, essentially what you are doing is you are allowing these casein micelles with these negatively charged tails that naturally repel each other to start sticking together and start forming a matrix. And as they start forming this matrix of protein, they entrap fats, they entrap carbohydrates such as lactose, and they start creating this curd. And if you looked at curd under a microscope, you'd really see a matrix of casein micelles, and as I was saying, surrounded by or within fat globules and smaller molecules. And so they're absolutely vital for cheese making. They allow milk to become cheese. But not only that, is that they give cheese all its key attributes. And I'll get into that in the next slide. So the problem that plant-based cheese manufacturers face is that casein micelles is, as I alluded, an incredibly important material for cheese making, yet they are only found in mammalian milk. Not only that, they are incredibly unique. You know, they've gone through millions of years of evolution to have these unique characteristics. And so there's no analogs, there's no real mimics like them found in the plant-based world, which essentially means that plant-based cheese manufacturers don't have the vital ingredient needed to make a delicious, good dairy cheese. And that's really illustrated on this slide, where you can see that with casein micelles and with plant-based fats and plant-based sugars, so not using animal fats, not using dairy sugars such as lactose, you can still come away with a delicious cheese, right? But if you don't have casein micelles, you don't get any of these cheese attributes. And so if we think about what this means for cheese in the future, right? To me, it means that if we want to move away from animal production for dairy cheese, we can't really go down the full plant-based route because we just simply don't have that vital casein micelle ingredient to make a cheese that's good enough for dairy consumers to easily switch to. So how else can we produce dairy proteins without requiring an animal? And that's where we get to this technology that many people are starting to hear about, this technology that really underpins cellular agriculture, which is fermentation. And for us, it's microbial fermentation. And this is a technology that's been around for quite a while, actually, first in therapeutics, and since the 1990s, it's been used for food. And I'll get into this a bit later, but it's actually the first food products made using this technology was for cheese. So very quickly, the way it works is that essentially you have a microbe, and you give that microbe the instructions, which is DNA, to produce your target protein. So for us, we have our microbes, and we give them instructions to produce casein protein. And we grow these microbes in fermentation tanks. And as the microbe grows, they begin producing our target protein, our casein protein. And obviously, the bigger the fermentation tank we have, the more microbes that will grow in there, and the more protein we get out. So something that you'll start hearing about a lot in this space is scale and scalability. And for us, that is simply increasing the size of the fermentation tanks from small 1 liter fermentation tanks, which are commonly used in-house, to 50,000 liter fermentation tanks, 100,000 liter fermentation tanks. We are really packing in a lot of microbes to make a lot of protein. Now, scaling up fermentation is one issue, and purifying out the protein after you have grown your microbes is another issue that scale makes more complicated, because you've got a lot of growth media, you've got a lot of microbes in there. You've got to purify all those away and only end up with your target protein, which is the casein protein. So that's the next step of the process. After you've grown and produced your protein, you want to purify everything out except for us, the casein protein. And then what we do is we take these casein proteins and we reconstitute them back into casein micelles. Because if you remember, natively in milk, casein proteins are found in this micellar form. Now, what's interesting is that if we had casein proteins not in a micellar form, just in singular monomeric forms dissolved in a solution, they wouldn't be functional. They wouldn't make cheese. And it's actually a fascinating process when you start off with individual casein proteins and you reconstitute them into a micelle. The way you know you've done that is you essentially start off with a transparent liquid, and as you reconstitute them into these proteins into micelles, it turns milky. Because as I explained, the milkiness, the whiteness of milk comes from casein micelles. And then after you've done that, you can add in your plant-based fats and plant-based sugars to really end up with a milk that you can take through the traditional cheese making process to make any cheese of choice. And for us, that's mozzarella. And one other thing to really hone in on is that as we are going through that traditional cheese making process, we're making a curd first. And if you remember, if you're not familiar with cheese making, a curd is a precursor to all cheese. So you're not limited to a specific cheese if you go through this traditional cheese making process. You can make any cheese you want from that curd. It depends how you treat that curd. Mozzarella is a first market for us, predominantly due to the size of the market. It's the biggest market in the US. And it's really a market that is in need of disruption. So that's on a high level how microbial fermentation works for this specific application. But obviously, you can use microbial fermentation to make other dairy proteins such as whey and stop at the fermentation step. So you make your engineer microbes, you grow them, you produce your whey protein, and then you stop. And you can sell it as an ingredient, for example. Or you can do many other things using this technology. But what this technology allows is to create animal proteins without the animal. And as I touched on earlier, this technology of microbial fermentation was the first used for cheese making. Because if we go back to this slide, you'll see here on the second step of cheese making, the coagulation step, when you add in that coagulation agent. So that coagulation agent that you add to turn that acidified milk into cheese, that's an animal enzyme. And natively it's sourced from the stomachs of young mammals, so predominantly calves. And this was done for many years, and it wasn't that economical. You get very small amounts of rennet, of chymosin per calf stomach. And you literally have to scrape it to get this enzyme off the stomach. And it's not that appetizing. So in the late 1980s and 1990s, people thought, why can't we make this enzyme in a cleaner way, in a more cost-effective way? And so they used the technology of microbial fermentation to do that. And that was the first microbial fermentation produced food product that was approved and given GRAS status by the FDA in 1990. And that really set a precedent that, this technology can be used for food, and especially can be used for dairy. And it really makes cheese a unique dairy category in the fact that, it's already a success of this technology. And it's already showcases that people will still consume and love cheese, even if it's using animal products that don't come from animals. And for us, what this technology allows us to do, as I've illustrated, is to make a product that is indistinguishable from its animal counterpart, so from animal-derived dairy mozzarella, but has a bunch of other key advantages. So not only is it sustainable and animal-free, it's lactose-free. So if we think about the amount of Americans that have lactose intolerant, it's around 40 million people. And current animal-derived cheese really impacts the amount or even the ability to consume cheese. It's also cholesterol-free. And we can really play with the amounts of saturated versus unsaturated fats for the cheese. So we can really make it a healthier product. And if we convert that into target demographics, we see that really for the first market and first commercialization, there's a few that we target here. One are vegans and vegetarians, and that's obviously a pretty obvious market. But as we start moving up this chart, I've already talked about lactose intolerant consumers, we start approaching very large markets of people that really are looking for a better cheese product, but haven't found it yet. They're looking for a healthier cheese. They're looking for a more sustainable cheese. But it's just not there. And one other thing to say is that, at New Culture, the way we think about this is that we don't want to rest on the laurels of just being animal-free and sustainable. That's fine. I mean, it will attract a lot of people to a cheese product that's animal-free, sustainable, but also indistinguishable from dairy cheese. We want to attract the mainstream dairy consumer, because that's really what's going to cause the biggest impact from a sustainability point of view, from an ethics point of view. And for us to do that, we simply just have to make the best cheese product at a good price, at ideally a lower price than what's currently out there. And microbial fermentation allows us to do that, because we're really starting from the foundation of cheese. We're starting from a molecular point of view. We're looking at each individual protein, piecing them together, understanding how we can make better casein micelles for cheese making, how we can make more functional cheese, better melting mozzarella, better stretching mozzarella. And all these properties we can start to really tweak and look at because of the nature of the technology that we're using. So that's what really excites me about the future of what we're doing, is that not only can we create this amazing product that now finally doesn't require an animal, but we can make it even better. And so that's what I'm really looking forward to in the future with New Culture doing that. And, the last slide I'll say is that we are actually looking to do a tasting next year. So definitely be on the lookout for that. And thanks so much for listening. Happy to answer any questions you all have. And I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Matt. For everyone in attendance, to ask a question, you can either raise your hand and I can unmute you, or feel free to type a question or a comment into the Q&A box and I can read it aloud. But Matt, I guess just to get us started, can you talk a little bit about, what in a perfect world, what do the next 12 months look like for you? Where will you be August 2021 if there's smooth sailing?
Yeah, I guess the keyword there is smooth sailing, because it's no secret that I think everyone on this call is aware that there's many difficulties happening right now in the world. So, but no, smooth sailing. One thing I do want to stress, and one thing that does concern me when I hear other people talking about this idea of cellular agriculture and using fermentation to replace food products, is that it's not going to happen anytime soon, unfortunately, at least from my point of view, because there's still a lot of work to scale. As I was mentioning, that's the key problem to address, or the key problem to solve. And you've got to realize that this technology has never really been thought of or built from a foundational point of view for food. And what that means is that When I talk about 50,000 litre and 100,000 litre fermentation tanks, those are huge, very expensive pieces of equipment. And there's only a handful of those in the world. Now, what that means is that there's very limited capacity. And that means that there's simply not enough right now to cause any sort of dent in the dairy industry. We could be doing 100,000 litre runs every day in our fermentation tanks, producing kilograms and kilograms of dairy protein, producing thousands of kilograms of cheese every day. And that, obviously that's not going to make an inch of difference, because so much milk is produced around the world. You know, if you think about where I'm from New Zealand, we're a big dairy producing nation. And we produce billions and billions of litres of milk. So if New Culture was to utilize every single fermentation tank around the world, every single industrial fermentation tank, we still wouldn't even outcompete New Zealand in its milk output. So that's one thing to stress, is that, you know, there's a lot of infrastructure, there's a lot of foundation to build for this idea of microbial fermentation and cellular agriculture to really cause mainstream shifts in consumer dietary habits, just from a supply point of view. And then from an actual technical point of view, it just takes a long time to optimize into scale. So for example, New Culture has been around for almost 2 years now. And, you know, over the next 12 months, to answer your question, if there's all smooth sailing, we'll have a cheese product to taste. We'll have a cheese product that people can try. But obviously that's just a proof of concept. That's not a commercial launch. It's not a go-to-market, because we have to scale up even more. We have to build partnerships across the supply chain. So, you know, long story short, there's a long way to go. And if the next 12 months go well, we'll be taking multiple steps in the right direction and moving incredibly quickly as we are. But there's still a massive long road ahead of us, and a huge road ahead of all the companies in this space to go towards, until we have the impact we want to have to achieve a more sustainable food system. But no, next 12 months, if all goes well, we'll have a very successful cheese tasting of most likely, possibly not, the world's first animal-free dairy mozzarella. And it should be evident from that tasting, from the types of dishes that we serve it on, how we serve it by itself, that it's essentially indistinguishable from a fresh Italian-style dairy mozzarella that you could buy from a farmer's market.
Great, thank you, Matt. Relatedly, an anonymous attendee asks, when do you think consumers will be able to buy your mozzarella?
Yeah, so as I say, we're looking to launch commercially most likely in 3 to 4 years' time. And a commercial launch to us is relatively small. That's a local launch, most likely supplying restaurants. So you could buy a New Culture mozzarella when you go to your favorite Italian restaurant, for example. We want to serve our cheese on the world's toughest stage, as we like to call it, and fine dining Italian restaurants where you can have it on a margherita pizza, you can have it in a caprese salad, to really showcase what our cheese can do and how good it is. So if all goes well, in 3 to 4 years' time, you could go to a restaurant, probably starting off in the Bay Area, and try some New Culture cheese. But you know, in the meantime, we'll have relatively frequent cheese tastings. So, you know, when we have the ability to travel again, which you know, is questionable when that will happen, we'll be looking to go to different parts of the US to allow people to try our cheese. Obviously, Wisconsin is a key area we'd love to go to. But no, first commercial launch, say about 3 to 4 years' time.
Great. Another question that's come in is, what type of yield do you get from casein into my cells?
Yeah, that's a very great technical question. So that's obviously a very important factor, because the casein that you don't get into my cells essentially becomes a whey-like product, right? It becomes a product that's not part of your cheese. And as all the cost of microbial fermentation, or I should say all the cost of producing our cheese goes into microbial fermentation. Each casein protein is worth a lot to us. So we want to make sure it all goes into my cells. I wouldn't give specifics, but I'd say the majority of it does. Most of it does. And we should be looking to get close to 100% very soon. Now, obviously, you know, one thing that we're competing against, you know, nature in a way. And so it takes a while for us to start getting in the same ballpark as Mother Nature, but we're very close. So I'd say the majority of it does go into my cells.
Great. Another question is, what are some of the uses for the whey protein?
Yeah. So we're not creating whey protein, but use of whey protein are quite a few. So whey protein, from a product point of view, is being used more and more. For example, ricotta cheese, right, is whey protein. Quite a lot of times they add casein to it to really increase that protein content, but most of it's whey. So you can make food products with it. You can use it as a functional ingredient, as an emulsifier, for example. So you'll see many food products on the shelf in grocery stores, whether they're soups or whether they're canned foods, other canned foods or packaged foods will contain milk products, and generally that's whey. As it serves as an emulsifier and oftentimes a stabilizer as well. And it's also used, you know, as a supplement, as a nutritional ingredient, either directly. So if you're an athlete or if you need to increase your protein consumption, you can make whey protein shakes. You can buy big tins of whey protein, and the reason why you can do that is because, or the reason why you can't really do it with casein, I should say, is because, you know, casein is more used to make the product, make the cheese, but whey is this byproduct. And so it's actually used in a lot of different use cases, and it's used in non-foods as well. It's used in glues. It's used in a whole variety. You'd be amazed at how many things require whey. So absolutely, it's a very commonly used protein.
Great. Steve Matsky asks, how is the current cost of the new culture version of mozzarella cheese looking? Any estimate at this point, or is it too early?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Right now, we're not really, I mean, we know the costs, and it's ridiculous, right? Because we haven't got to the point where scale is going to drastically bring down the cost. So when we produce cheese in-house, we have small fermentation bioreactors that make protein that we make cheese with, and due to the scale that we're making cheese at right now, you know, the costs are probably in like tens of thousands of dollars per pound or per kilogram, right? We're more focused now on actually creating an amazing product. Fortunately, for microbial fermentation, it's a path that's relatively well trodden. And what I mean by that is there's low-hanging fruit and there's industry best practices that we know that are commonly done to bring those costs down, right? So we know and we can predict, and we've done a lot of modeling on understanding exactly how we can bring those costs down and the milestones we need to reach to get to price parity with dairy mozzarella. But there's no point focusing on that until you know you can make a delicious cheese. So we're really focusing on making that amazing product. And then after we've done that, looking at how we made it, the ingredients we use, and think about, okay, now how do we scale this? And we've done a lot of thinking here, and we know that path, but we haven't started looking at bringing the costs down quite yet. That's something that we're going to look to do next year. As I say, as we come out with this cheese for this tasting, we'll be really looking at thinking about, okay, we've got the product, now let's scale it. Let's think about exactly how we get to commercialization. So right now, yeah, it's probably too early, but if I was to give you a number, it would be eye-watering. It would be in the tens of thousands of dollars per pound.
Thanks, Matt. A couple related questions here. John Crawford asks, what human testing have you completed to assure no unexpected digestive or other negative problems? And then is casein an allergen? Is there a concern about the casein microbe escaping and getting into other food undetected?
Yeah, so those are great questions. So to answer the first one, there's a couple of layers to that. So if you're making the native protein, so you know, bit of biology 101, you've got your protein that's made up of amino acids. If you're taking that same amino acid sequence that is found in a native dairy casein protein from a cow, and you create that with a microbe, that's an identical protein. So just looking at the science, looking at the literature, looking at how many recombinant products have been made, and how safe they are, if they have that same amino acid sequence, if they function the same, then you can be pretty rest assured that it's going to be safe to consume. Obviously, that's not good enough. We do want to and will be doing a lot of testing to make sure it is safe, doing allergenicity tests and other toxicology tests and things such as that. We're not at that stage right now to begin doing that. We have a path to understanding and getting that green light, not only internally, but from the FDA on our product. But there's a lot of precedent set by the FDA in the creation of identical proteins using microbial fermentation to their native counterparts being pretty safe. Now, going to that second question, casein is an allergen, right? So absolutely, the protein that we're producing is going to have allergenic epitopes, is going to react to certain people. And childhood allergenicity of dairy is actually, I believe, it's the second biggest allergy in the United States. So it's a huge allergen. And we're going to have those same allergenic epitopes because, as I said earlier, we're making the exact same amino acid sequence, making the same protein. In the future, not now, but a long time in the future, we'll be able to remove those allergenic epitopes and come away with a dairy protein that anyone can consume. So that's really exciting to think about, but it's not something that we're going to do quite so soon. The way it works from a microbial point of view and on the question about the microbe escaping and getting into the wild, as it were. So there's a few different things to say about that. One is that, the way we grow our microbes here and the way microbes grow industrially is in very strict conditions. Things have to be sanitized, and we have to really do GMP and food grade best practices. So there's unlikely to be any contamination in that sense. And the other thing to say is that, it's an unlikely scenario because what we're effectively doing, right, when we engineer microbes and we grow them in these fermentation tanks, is that we're optimizing growth conditions. We're growing microbes in a way that's, is ideal for a specific microbe. And these conditions are only found in this small little, right now, that will be big bioreactor. And so those same conditions, those same optimized conditions are unlikely to be found externally. And so it's very unlikely that a microbe can just contaminate a microbe that we engineer can contaminate because it's actually quite sensitive. So given that, we still do a lot of best practices, and there obviously are best practices in industry because this technology has been around for decades and decades. So it's one of these risks that you have a lot of safeguards to mitigate.
Terrific. Thanks, Matt. An anonymous attendee asks, who do you consider your biggest competitors, and do you think you can get to market first?
Yeah. So um, the way we think about it is that our biggest competitors are animal-derived dairy manufacturers, right? Like that's who our biggest competitor is. That's who we're going after. And that's sort of and in fact will be our biggest competitors, because when we get to commercialization, when we start actually producing much more products, it's going to be the dairy industry in the United States that's going to give us the biggest pushback. Obviously, there's a lot of subsidies for dairy manufacturers, for dairy producers, and there's a lot of lobbying done, and so that's going to be a huge group to have to compete with and to have to push back on. So that's overall who we see our competitors. There are definitely other players in the cellular agriculture umbrella that are working on similar things, right? There's about 5 or 6 people, and everyone's generally focused on different products. There's a few that focus on cheese. So we have to think of ourselves as really the leaders in structured cheese. And what I mean by structured cheese is cheese that requires my cells to make. So mozzarella, Parmesan, brie, cheddar, things such as that. Because we have a team that are amazing protein scientists, understand the biophysics, the biochemistry of casein proteins, of forming my cells with them and making cheese for them. And we've done a lot of work over the last year to really understand more than most people exactly how that all works. So from going to market with a mozzarella cheese, I'd like to think that we could be the first. But at the end of the day, as I said at the beginning, we're going to have to all work together to be able to get our products to market the way we want to, because we're going to be up against a very well-funded, well-connected industry group, which is the dairy industry, and it's not going to be an easy fight. So yeah, I'd say that's the real competition.
Great, thanks, Matt. Peter Hawthorne asks, Matt, what scale of fermentation vessels have you used to date? What are the likely scale-up sizing stages, such as development, semi-works, commercial, and vessel sizes that you would employ?
Yeah, so for the most part, we're still at a bench scale. What that means is, below 100 liters in terms of vessel size. And we're looking to get to pilot scale next year. So that's around 1,000 to 3,000 liters. And very soon after that, we can start making these leapfrogs to 10,000 liters to 50,000 liters. Now, as I said, there's certain volumes that are in pretty limited supply. So it's really on us finding and connecting with the right people here, forming partnerships, and be able to get that capacity locked in. So, as I said, we're a 2-year-old company, and what we've essentially done, I like to think, is we've really built the foundation of how we're going to scale and how we're going to make cheese. And next year is about scale. So next year we'll be at pilot scale, and not too long after that we should start hitting industrial scales.
Thanks, Matt. Related to the prior question, Tom Gable asks, given your current commercial product roadmap is another 3 to 4 years out, are you confident your tech will hold a lead position relative to other alternative dairy products or technology?
Yeah, so, I think this idea of microbial fermentation is still the #1 contender for actually replacing animal-derived cheese, right now at least. There's other technologies that people are starting to utilize where, for example, they are producing actual secreted milk using epithelial cells. So, for example, growing mammalian cells in a bioreactor and inducing them to lactate and to produce milk. That's another potential technology that may become more viable. Whenever you deal with mammalian cells, it's a completely different kettle of fish. Then we deal with microbes. They're incredibly finicky, sensitive, very, very difficult to scale up, and very expensive to grow. So I think that that in 10 or 20 years' time, that may be the leading technology once we optimize the many problems that mammalian cell culture brings. But right now, microbial fermentation, as I said, has a pretty rich history in industrial scale-up and producing proteins for food. And I just don't think really we have the time to wait 10 or 20 years for another technology to come out. We need to act now. And so that's why I think microbial fermentation right now is the leading tech that we should use, and that's the reason why New Culture is using it. And also, as I illustrated, I think from us, forming the team that we've formed, we've really built this foundation of protein understanding, because you can grow as much casein protein as you want in a bioreactor, right? But you've got to make that functional. As I said, it's not going to be functional unless it is in a micellar form, in a colloidal particle. And that's no easy feat. It's no easy feat to also turn that colloidal particle into a delicious cheese. So that right there is also something that we've spent a lot of time on, and we think we've achieved quite a lot. And so it's really a testament to the team we have at New Culture that, and testament to cheese actually, that we're some of the most brilliant scientists in the world, I believe. And rather than solving some other big challenges, they've come to us to work on cheese.
Great, thanks. One final question, Matt. Obviously there's a lot of industry pushback in milk and meat to be called milk and meat respectively there. Yeah. Have you seen any beginnings of that in the cheese space, or do you think in 5 or 6 years when you're on the market, do you think you will be called cheese, or how do you think that will shake out?
Yeah, so that touches on a really interesting topic, and that is, what do we call our products? So plant-based cheese manufacturers have already started dealing with this, and generally they can't call their product cheese because cheese is categorized as a standard of identity as a product derived from the lactation of a mammal. And plant proteins, coconut oils aren't lactated by animals. So just from a standard of identity point of view, you can't legally call it cheese. And for us, we could make an identical product. We could produce dairy fats using microbial fermentation. We could produce lactose. We could make an identical product to dairy cheese, but legally we couldn't call it cheese. So that's where it stands right now. I'd like to think that as the space of cellular agriculture for dairy grows, as the need for change increases because of climate change threats and other sustainability issues, and as this idea and this understanding that we're actually creating a dairy product, right? We're making a cheese, but just in a different way. That the standard of identity will be changed or be updated for a better world, for a new world. And so that's the situation right now. there's things that we can call our products, but we can't call it cheese. And so we'll see where we end up when we do launch on the market. But I'm really hopeful that this space will have matured very quickly, because the one thing about the space is that it moves quick. And there should be many more players in the market. Most of the companies should be much more well-funded, have the capacity to really start talking to the right people about this very important labeling topic, because even though it's just a word, right, it's hugely important. If we can't call it cheese, then that instantly registers to the consumer. If we can't put it on an aisle right next to the other dairy cheeses, if it gets lumped into the plant-based or vegan cheese aisle, that's also very, very impactful. So there's certain things that are incredibly important, and the dairy industry knows they're important because that's why they're pushing back on it. That we think it's in our right to fight for, and we definitely will be doing that. But it's going to be a fight that I think this industry or this movement of cellular agriculture needs to mature a bit more to have a chance in.
Great, thanks, Matt. One final question, since we're running out of time. How can people get a hold of you? What's the best way? I see your email there. Is it okay for folks to email you directly?
Yeah, we can email me directly. Absolutely. So I'm always interested to hear people's perspectives on things, to answer questions about this technology of cellular agriculture, of microbial fermentation. I think it's essential for companies like New Culture to be approachable. The worst thing that can happen is, what happened, unfortunately, to a lot of the technologies in the 90s, specifically around GMOs, where it was considered this black box technology that no one really knew about, and there's a lot of scaremongering, a lot of fearmongering. And so even though our product is GMO-free, it doesn't contain any GMOs, it's still a product that people don't quite understand how we do it. What is microbial fermentation? And definitely, if we aren't responsive, if we aren't transparent, educational, if we don't have the right messaging, that can be a problem. So absolutely, if you've got any questions, if you think you can help, if you want to provide feedback, then I'm always all ears and very much willing to read and engage and learn.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Matt. Well, that concludes our presentation today. Please register for upcoming agri-food conversations at agrifoodconversations.com. We host these every week, every Thursday at 3 p.m. Central. We hope to see you during future webinars. And again, a replay of this will be made available. Please disperse it as you see fit to other people who you might find this interesting. And hopefully you and Matt from New Culture can keep the conversation going. So thanks to all the attendees. Matt, thank you so much for presenting, and best of luck with New Culture, and we will talk to you soon.
Thanks. Thanks a lot, Tim.